Letter 20, Part 1. Shingoji, July 21st. Very early in the morning, after my long talk with the Kocho of Kanayama, Ito wakened me by saying, "You'll be able for a long day's journey today, as you had a chicken yesterday." And under this chicken's marvelous influence, we got away at 6:45, only to verify the proverb, "The more haste, the worse speed." Unsolicited by me, the Kocho sent round the village to forbid the people from assembling, so I got away in peace with a pack horse and one runner. It was a terrible road with 2 severe mountain passes to cross, and I not only had to walk nearly the whole way, but to help the man with the kuruma up some of the steepest places. Halting at the exquisitely situated village of Nozoki, we got one horse, and walked by a mountain road along the headwaters of the Omono to Innai. I wish I could convey to you any idea of the beauty and wildness of that mountain route, of the surprises on the way, of views, on the violent deluges of rain which turned rivulets into torrents, and of the hardships and difficulties of the day, the scanty fare of sun-dried rice dough and sour yellow rasps, and the depth of the mire through which we waded. We crossed the Shione and Sakatsu passes, and in 12 hours accomplished 15 miles. Everywhere we were told that we should never get through the country by the way we are going. The women still wear trousers, but with a long garment tucked into them instead of a short one, and the men wear a cotton combination of breastplate and apron, either without anything else or over their kimonos. The descent to Innai under an avenue of cryptomeria, and the village itself, shut in with the rushing Omono, are very beautiful. The yadoya at Innai was a remarkably cheerful one, but my room was entirely fusuma and shoji, and people were peeping in the whole time. It is not only a foreigner and his strange ways which attract attention in these remote districts, but, in my case, my India rubber bath, air pillow, and, above all, my white mosquito net. Their nets are all of a heavy green canvas, and they admire mine so much that I can give no more acceptable present on leaving than a piece of it to twist in with the hair. There were 6 engineers in the next room who are surveying the passes which I had crossed, in order to see if they could be tunneled, in which case kurumas might go all the way from Tokyo to Kubota on the Sea of Japan, and, with a small additional outlay, carts also. In the 2 villages of Upper and Lower Innai there has been an outbreak of a malady much dreaded by the Japanese, called kakke, which, in the last 7 months, has carried off 100 persons out of a population of about 1,500, and the local doctors have been aided by 2 sent from the medical school at Kubota. I don't know a European name for it. The Japanese name signifies an affection of the legs. Its first symptoms are a loss of strength in the legs, looseness in the knees, cramps in the calves, swelling and numbness. This Dr. Anderson, who has studied kakke in more than 1,100 cases in Tokyo, calls the subacute form. The chronic is a slow, numbing and wasting malady, which, if unchecked, results in death from paralysis and exhaustion in from 6 months to 3 years. The third, or acute form, Dr. Anderson describes thus. After remarking that the grave symptoms set in quite unexpectedly and go on rapidly increasing, he says, "The patient now can lie down no longer. He sits up in bed and tosses restlessly from one position to another, and, with wrinkled brow, staring and anxious eyes, dusky skin, blue parted lips, dilated nostrils, throbbing neck and labouring chest, presents a picture of the most terrible distress that the worst of diseases can inflict. There is no intermission even for a moment, and the physician, here almost powerless, can do little more than note the failing pulse and falling temperature, and wait for the moment when the brain, paralyzed by the carbonized blood, shall become insensible, and allowed a dying man to pass his last moments in merciful unconsciousness. The next morning, after riding 9 miles through a quagmire under grand avenues of cryptomeria, and noticing with regret that the telegraph poles ceased, we reached Yuzowa, a town of 7,000 people, in which, had it not been for provoking delays, I should have slept instead of at Inai, and found that a fire a few hours previously had destroyed 70 houses, including the yadoya at which I should have lodged. We had to wait 2 hours for horses, as all were engaged in moving property and people. The ground where the houses had stood was absolutely bare of everything but fine black ash, among which the kuras stood blackened, and, in some instances, slightly cracked, but in all unharmed. Already skeletons of new houses were rising. No life had been lost, except that of a tipsy man, but I should probably have lost everything but my money. Letter 20, Part 2. Yuzowa is a specially objectionable-looking place. I took my lunch, a wretched meal of a tasteless white curd made from beans, with some condensed milk added to it, in a yard, and the people crowded in hundreds to the gate, and those behind, being unable to see me, got ladders and climbed on the adjacent roofs, where they remained till one of the roofs gave way with a loud crash, and precipitated about 50 men, women, and children into the room below, which fortunately was vacant. Nobody screamed, a noteworthy fact, and the casualties were only a few bruises. 4 policemen then appeared and demanded my passport, as if I were responsible for the accident, and failing, like all others, to read a particular word upon it, they asked me what I was travelling for, and on being told to learn about the country, they asked if I was making a map. Having satisfied their curiosity, they disappeared, and the crowd surged up again in fuller force. The transport agent begged them to go away, but they said they might never see such a sight again. One old peasant said he would go away if he were told whether the sight were a man or a woman, and, on the agent asking if that were any business of his, he said he should like to tell at home what he had seen, which awoke my sympathy at once, and I told Ito to tell them that a Japanese horse galloping night and day without ceasing would take 5½ weeks to reach my country, a statement which he is using lavishly as I go along. These are such queer crowds, so silent and gaping, and they remain motionless for hours, the wide-awake babies on the mothers' backs and in their fathers' arms, never crying. I should be glad to hear a hearty aggregate laugh, even if I were its object. The great melancholy stare is depressing. The road for 10 miles was thronged with country people going in to see the fire. It was a good road and very pleasant country, with numerous roadside shrines and figures of the Goddess of Mercy. I had a wicked horse, thoroughly vicious. His head was doubly chained to the saddle girth, but he never met man, woman, or child without laying back his ears and running at them to bite them. I was so tired and in so much spinal pain that I got off and walked several times, and it was most difficult to get on again, for as soon as I put my hand on the saddle, he swung his hind legs round to kick me, and it required some agility to avoid being hurt. Nor was this all. The evil beast made dashes with his feathered head at flies, threatening to twist or demolish my foot at each, flung his hind legs upwards, attempted to dislodge flies on his nose with his hind hoof, executed capers which involved the total disappearance of everything in front of the saddle, squealed, stumbled, kicked his old shoes off, and resented the feeble attempts which the mago made to replace them, and finally walked into Yokote and down its long and dismal street mainly on its hind legs, shaking the rope out of his timid leader's hand and shaking me into a sort of aching jelly. I used to think that horses were made vicious either by being teased or by violence in breaking, but this does not account for the malignity of the Japanese horses, for the people are so much afraid of them that they treat them with great respect. They are not beaten or kicked, are spoken to in soothing tones, and, on the whole, live better than their masters. Perhaps this is the secret of their villainy. Jeshurun waxed fat and kicked. Yokote, a small town of 10,000 people, in which the best yadoyas are all non-respectable, is an ill-favored, ill-smelling, forlorn, dirty, damp, miserable place, with a large trade in cottons. As I rode through on my temporary biped, the people rushed out from the baths to see me, men and women alike, without a particle of clothing. The housemaster was very polite, but I had a dark and dirty room, up a bamboo ladder, and it swarmed with fleas and mosquitoes to an exasperating extent. On the way I heard that a bullock was killed every Thursday in Yokote, and had decided on having a broiled steak for supper and taking another with me. But when I arrived, it all was sold, there were no eggs, and I made a miserable meal of rice and bean curd, feeling somewhat starved, as the condensed milk I bought at Yamagata had to be thrown away. I was somewhat wretched from fatigue and inflamed ant bites, but in the early morning, hot and misty as all the mornings have been, I went to see a Shinto temple, or miya, and, though I went alone, escaped a throng. The entrance into the temple court was, as usual, by a torii, which consisted of 2 large posts 20 feet high, surmounted with cross beams, the upper one of which projects beyond the posts and frequently curves upwards at both ends. The whole, as is often the case, was painted a dull red. This torii, or bird's rest, is said to be so called because the fowls which were formerly offered but not sacrificed were accustomed to perch upon it. A straw rope with straw tassels and strips of paper hanging from it, the special emblem of Shinto, hung across the gateway. In the paved court there were several handsome granite lanterns on fine granite pedestals, such as are the nearly universal accompaniments of both Shinto and Buddhist temples. After leaving Yakote, we passed through very pretty country with mountain views and occasional glimpses of the snowy dome of Chokaizan, crossed the Omono, which has burst its banks and destroyed its bridges, by 2 troublesome ferries, and arrived at Rokugo, a town of 5,000 people, with fine temples, exceptionally mean houses, and the most aggressive crowd by which I have yet been asphyxiated. There, through the good offices of the police, I was enabled to attend a Buddhist funeral of a merchant of some wealth. It interested me very much from its solemnity and decorum, and Ito's explanations of what went before were remarkably distinctly given. I went in a Japanese woman's dress, borrowed at the tea-house, with a blue hood over my head, and thus escaped all notice, but I found the restraint of the scanty tied-forward kimono very tiresome. Ito gave me many injunctions as to what I was to do and avoid, which I carried out faithfully, being nervously anxious to avoid jarring on the sensibilities of those who had kindly permitted a foreigner to be present. The illness was a short one, and there had been no time either for prayers or pilgrimages on the sick man's behalf. When death occurs, the body is laid with its head to the north, a position that the living Japanese scrupulously avoid. Near a folding screen, between which and it a new zen is placed, on which are a saucer of oil with a lighted rush, cakes of uncooked rice dough, and a saucer of incense sticks. The priests directly after death choose the kaimyo, or posthumous name, write it on a tablet of white wood, and seat themselves by the corpse. His zen, bowls, cups, etc., are filled with vegetable food and are placed by his side, the chopsticks being put on the wrong, that is, the left side of the zen. At the end of 48 hours, the corpse is arranged for the coffin by being washed with warm water, and the priest, while saying certain prayers, shaves the head. In all cases, rich or poor, the dress is of the usual make, but of pure white linen or cotton. At Omagori, a town near Rokugo, large earthenware jars are manufactured, which are much used for interment by the wealthy. But in this case there were 2 square boxes, the outer one being of finely planed wood of the Retinospora obtusa. The poor use what is called the quick tub, a covered tub of pine hooped with bamboo. Women are dressed for burial in the silk robe worn on the marriage day. Tabi are placed beside them or on their feet, and their hair usually flows loosely behind them. The wealthiest people fill the coffin with vermilion, and the poorest use chaff, but in this case I heard that only the mouth, nose, and ears were filled with vermilion, and that the coffin was filled up with coarse incense. The body is placed within the tub or box in the usual squatting position. It is impossible to understand how a human body, many hours after dead, can be pressed into the limited space afforded by even the outermost of the boxes. It has been said that the rigidity of a corpse is overcome by the use of a powder called dosia, which is sold by the priests, but this idea has been exploded, and the process remains incomprehensible. Bannerets of small size and ornamental staves were outside the house door. 2 men in blue dresses with pale blue overgarments resembling wings received each person. 2 more presented a lacquered bowl of water and a white silk crepe towel, and then we passed into a large room, round which were arranged a number of very handsome folding screens, on which lotuses, storks, and peonies were realistically painted on a dead gold ground. Near the end of the room the coffin, under a canopy of white silk, upon which there was a very beautiful arrangement of artificial white lotuses, rested upon trestles, the face of the corpse being turned towards the north. 6 priests, very magnificently dressed, sat on each side of the coffin, and 2 more knelt in front of a small temporary altar. The widow, an extremely pretty woman, squatted near the deceased, below the father and mother, and after her came the children, relatives, and friends, who sat in rows, dressed in winged garments of blue and white. The widow was painted white, her lips were reddened with vermilion, her hair was elaborately dressed and ornamented with carved shell-pins. She wore a beautiful dress of sky-blue silk, with a haori of fine white crepe and a scarlet crepe girdle embroidered in gold, and looked like a bride on her marriage day rather than a widow. Indeed, owing to the beauty of the dresses and the amount of blue and white silk, the room had a festal rather than a funereal look. When all the guests had arrived, tea and sweetmeats were passed round. Incense was burned profusely, litanies were mumbled, and the bustle of moving to the grave began, during which I secured a place near the gate of the temple grounds. The procession did not contain the father or mother of the deceased, but I understood that the mourners who composed it were all relatives. The oblong tablet with the dead name of the deceased was carried first by a priest, then the lotus blossom by another priest, then 10 priests followed, 2 and 2, chanting litanies from books. Then came the coffin on a platform borne by 4 men and covered with white drapery, then the widow, and then the other relatives. The coffin was carried into the temple and laid upon trestles, while incense was burned and prayers were said, and was then carried to a shallow grave lined with cement, and prayers were said by the priests until the earth was raised to the proper level, when all dispersed, and the widow, in her gay attire, walked home unattended. There were no hired mourners or any signs of grief, but nothing could be more solemn, reverent, and decorous than the whole service. I have seen many funerals, chiefly of the poor, and, though shorn of much of the ceremony and with only one officiating priest, the decorum was always most remarkable. The fees to the priests are from 2 up to 40 or 50 yen. The graveyard which surrounds the temple was extremely beautiful, and the cryptomeria specially fine. It was very full of stone gravestones, and, like all Japanese cemeteries, exquisitely kept. As soon as the grave was filled in, a life-size pink lotus plant was placed upon it, and a lacquer tray on which were lacquer bowls containing tea or sake, beans, and sweetmeats. The temple at Rokugo was very beautiful, and, except that its ornaments were superior in solidity and good taste, differed little from a Romish church. The low altar, on which were lilies and lighted candles, was draped in blue and silver, and on the high altar, draped in crimson and cloth of gold, there was nothing but a closed shrine, an incense burner, and a vase of lotuses. Letter 20, Part 3. At a wayside tea-house, soon after leaving Rokugo in Kurumas, I met the same courteous and agreeable young doctor who was stationed at Inai during the prevalence of kakke, and he invited me to visit the hospital of Kubota, of which he is junior physician, and told Ito of a restaurant at which foreign food can be obtained, a pleasant prospect of which he is always reminding me. Travelling along a very narrow road, I, as usual first, we met a man leading a prisoner by a rope, followed by a policeman. As soon as my runner saw the latter, he fell down on his face so suddenly in the shafts as nearly to throw me out, at the same time trying to wriggle into a garment which he had carried on the crossbar, while the young men who were drawing the two kurumas behind, crouching behind my vehicle, tried to scuttle into their clothes. I never saw such a picture of abjectness as my man presented. He trembled from head to foot and illustrated that queer phrase often heard in Scotch Presbyterian prayers, "Lay our hands on our mouths and our mouths in the dust." He literally grovelled in the dust, and with every sentence that a policeman spoke raised his head a little, to bow it yet more deeply than before. It was all because he had no clothes on. I interceded for him as the day was very hot, and the policeman said he would not arrest him, as he should otherwise have done, because of the inconvenience that it would cause to a foreigner. He was quite an elderly man and never recovered his spirits, but as soon as a turn of the road took us out of the policeman's sight, the two younger men threw their clothes into the air and gambolled in the shafts, shrieking with laughter. On reaching Shingoji, being too tired to go farther, I was dismayed to find nothing but a low, dark, foul-smelling room, enclosed only by dirty shoji, in which to spend Sunday. One side looked into a little mildewed court with a slimy growth of Protococcus viridis, and into which the people of another house constantly came to stare. The other side opened on the earthen passage into the street, where travellers washed their feet, the third into the kitchen, and the fourth into the front room. Even before dark it was alive with mosquitoes, and the fleas hopped on the mats like sandflies. There were no eggs, nothing but rice and cucumbers. At 5 on Sunday morning I saw 3 faces pressed against the outer lattice, and before evening the shoji were riddled with finger holes, at each of which a dark eye appeared. There was a still, fine rain all day, with the mercury at 82 degrees, and the heat, darkness, and smells were difficult to endure. In the afternoon a small procession passed the house, consisting of a decorated palanquin, carried and followed by priests, with capes and stoles over crimson chasubles and white cassocks. This ark, they said, contained papers inscribed with the names of people and the evils they feared, and the priests were carrying the papers to throw them into the river. I went to bed early as a refuge from mosquitoes, with the andon, as usually, dimly lighting the room, and shut my eyes. About 9 I heard a good deal of whispering and shuffling, which continued for some time, and, on looking up, saw opposite to me about 40 men, women, and children, Ito says 100, all staring at me, with the light upon their faces. They had silently removed 3 of the shoji next the passage. I called Ito loudly and clapped my hands, but they did not stir till he came, and then they fled like a flock of sheep. I have patiently, and even smilingly, borne all out-of-doors crowding and curiosity, but this kind of intrusion is unbearable, and I sent Ito to the police station, much against his will, to beg the police to keep the people out of the house, as the housemaster was unable to do so. This morning, as I was finishing dressing, a policeman appeared in my room, ostensibly to apologize for the behavior of the people, but in reality to have a privileged stare at me, and above all at my stretcher and mosquito net, from which he hardly took his eyes. Ito says he could make a yen a day by showing them. The policeman said that the people had never seen a foreigner. Letter 21. Kubota, July 23rd. I arrived here on Monday afternoon by the river Omono, what would have been 2 long days' journey by land having been easily accomplished in 9 hours by water. This was an instance of forming a plan wisely and adhering to it resolutely. Firmness in travelling is nowhere more necessary than in Japan. I decided some time ago, from Mr. Brunton's map, that the Omono must be navigable from Shingoji, and a week ago told Ito to inquire about it, but at each place difficulties have been started. There was too much water, there was too little, there were bad rapids, there were shallows, it was too late in the year, all the boats which had started lately were lying aground, but at one of the ferries I saw in the distance a merchandise boat going down, and told Ito I should go that way and no other. On arriving at Shingoji, they said it was not on the Omono at all, but on a stream with some very bad rapids in which boats are broken to pieces. Lastly, they said there was no boat, but on my saying that I would send 10 miles for one, a small, flat-bottomed scow was produced by the transport agent, into which Ito, the luggage, and myself accurately fitted. Ito sententiously observed, "Not one thing has been told us on our journey which has turned out true." This is not an exaggeration. The usual crowd did not assemble round the door, but preceded me to the river, where it covered the banks and clustered in the trees. 4 policemen escorted me down. The voyage of 42 miles was delightful. The rapids were a mere ripple, the current was strong, one boatman almost slept upon his paddle, the other only woke to bail the boat when it was half full of water. The shores were silent and pretty, and almost without population till we reached the large town of Araya, which straggles along a high bank for a considerable distance, and after 9 peaceful hours we turned off from the main stream of the Omono just at the outskirts of Kubota and poled up a narrow, green river, fringed by dilapidated backs of houses, boat-building yards, and rafts of timber on one side, and dwelling-houses, gardens, and damp greenery on the other. This stream is crossed by very numerous bridges. I got a cheerful upstairs room at a most friendly yadoya, and my 3 days here have been fully occupied and very pleasant. Foreign food, a good beefsteak, an excellent curry, cucumbers, and foreign salt and mustard were at once obtained, and I felt my eyes lightened after partaking of them. Kubota is a very attractive and purely Japanese town of 36,000 people, the capital of Akita-ken. A fine mountain, called Taihei-san, rises above its fertile valley, and the Omono falls into the Sea of Japan close to it. It has a number of kurumas, but, owing to heavy sand and the badness of the roads, they can only go 3 miles in any direction. It is a town of activity and brisk trade, and manufactures a silk fabric in stripes of blue and black, and yellow and black, much used for making hakama and kimonos, a species of white silk crepe with a raised roof, which brings a high price in Tokyo shops, fusuma and clogs. Though it is a castle town, it is free from the usual deadly lively look, and has an air of prosperity and comfort. Though it has few streets of shops, it covers a great extent of ground with streets and lanes of pretty, isolated dwelling houses, surrounded by trees, gardens, and well-trimmed hedges, each garden entered by a substantial gateway. The existence of something like a middle class with home privacy and home life is suggested by these miles of comfortable suburban residences. Foreign influence is hardly at all felt, there is not a single foreigner in government or any other employment, and even the hospital was organized from the beginning by Japanese doctors. This fact made me greatly desire to see it, but on going there at the proper hour for visitors, I was met by the director with courteous but vexatious denial. No foreigner could see it, he said, without sending his passport to the governor and getting a written order, so I complied with these preliminaries, and 8 a.m. of the next day was fixed for my visit. Ito, who is lazy about interpreting for the lower orders, but exerts himself to the utmost on such an occasion as this, went with me, handsomely clothed in silk as befitted an interpreter, and surpassed all his former efforts. The director and the staff of 6 physicians, all handsomely dressed in silk, met me at the top of the stairs and conducted me to the management room, where 6 clerks were writing. Here there was a table, solemnly covered with a white cloth, and 4 chairs on which the director, the chief physician, Ito, and I sat, and pipes, tea, and sweetmeats were produced. After this, accompanied by 50 medical students whose intelligent looks promise well for their success, we went round the hospital, which is a large 2-storied building in semi-European style, but with deep verandas all round. The upper floor is used for classrooms, and the lower accommodates 100 patients, besides a number of resident students. 10 is the largest number treated in any one room, and severe cases are treated in separate rooms. Gangrene has prevailed, and the chief physician, who is at this time remodeling the hospital, has closed some of the wards in consequence. There is a lock hospital under the same roof. About 50 important operations are annually performed under chloroform, but the people of Akita-ken are very conservative and object to part with their limbs and to foreign drugs. This conservatism diminishes the number of patients. The odor of carbolic acid pervaded the whole hospital, and there were spray producers enough to satisfy Mr. Lister. At the request of Dr. K, I saw the dressing of some very severe wounds carefully performed with carbolized gauze under spray of carbolic acid, the fingers of the surgeon and the instrument used being all carefully bathed in the disinfectant. Dr. K said it was difficult to teach the students the extreme carefulness with regard to minor details which is required in the antiseptic treatment, which he regards as one of the greatest discoveries of this century. I was very much impressed with the fortitude shown by the surgical patients, who went through very severe pain without a wince or a moan. Eye cases are unfortunately very numerous. Dr. K attributes their extreme prevalence to overcrowding, defective ventilation, poor living, and bad light. After our round, we returned to the management room to find a meal laid out in English style, coffee in cups with handles and saucers, and plates with spoons. After this, pipes were again produced, and the director and medical staff escorted me to the entrance, where we all bowed profoundly. I was delighted to see that Dr. Kayabashi, a man under 30 and fresh from Tokyo, and all the staff and students were in the national dress with the hakama of rich silk. It is a beautiful dress and assists dignity as much as the ill-fitting European costume detracts from it. This was a very interesting visit, in spite of the difficulty of communication through an interpreter. The public buildings with their fine gardens and the broad road near which they stand, with its stone-faced embankments, are very striking in such a far-off ken. Among the finest of the buildings is the normal school, where I shortly afterwards presented myself, but I was not admitted till I had shown my passport and explained my objects in travelling. These preliminaries being settled, Mr. Tomatsu Aoki, the chief director, and Mr. Shude Kane Nigishi, the principal teacher, both looking more like monkeys than men in their European clothes, lionized me. The first was most trying, for he persisted in attempting to speak English, of which he knows about as much as I know of Japanese, but the last, after some grotesque attempts, accepted Ito's services. The school is a commodious Europeanized building, 3 stories high, and from its upper balcony the view of the city with its grey roofs and abundant greenery, and surrounding mountains and valleys, is very fine. The equipments of the different classrooms surprised me, especially the laboratory of the chemical classroom and the truly magnificent illustrative apparatus in the natural science classroom. Gano's Physics is the textbook of that department. Letter 22. Kubota, July 23rd. My next visit was to a factory of hand-loom silk weavers, where 180 hands, half of them women, are employed. These new industrial openings for respectable employment for women and girls are very important and tend in the direction of a much-needed social reform. The striped silk fabrics produced are entirely for home consumption. Afterwards I went into the principal street, and after a long search through the shops, bought some condensed milk with the Eagle brand and the label all right, but, on opening it, found it to contain small pellets of a brownish dried curd with an unpleasant taste. As I was sitting in the shop, half stifled by the crowd, the people suddenly fell back to a respectful distance, leaving me breathing space, and a message came from the chief of police to say that he was very sorry for the crowding, and had ordered 2 policemen to attend upon me for the remainder of my visit. The black and yellow uniforms were most truly welcome, and since then I have escaped all annoyance. On my return I found the card of the chief of police, who had left a message with the housemaster apologizing for the crowd by saying that foreigners very rarely visit Kubota, and he thought that the people had never seen a foreign woman. I went afterwards to the central police station to inquire about an inland route to Aomori, and received much courtesy, but no information. The police everywhere are very gentle to the people. A few quiet words or a wave of the hand are sufficient when they do not resist them. They belong to the samurai class, and doubtless their naturally superior position weighs with the heimin. Their faces and a certain hauteur of manner show the indelible class distinction. The entire police force of Japan numbers 23,300 educated men in the prime of life, and if 30% of them do wear spectacles, it does not detract from their usefulness. 5,600 of them are stationed at Yezo, as from thence they can be easily sent wherever they are wanted. 1,004 at Kyoto and 815 at Osaka, and the remaining 10,000 are spread over the country. The police force costs something over £400,000 annually, and certainly is very efficient in preserving good order. The pay of ordinary constables ranges from 6 to 10 yen a month. An enormous quantity of superfluous writing is done by all officialdom in Japan, and one usually sees policemen writing. What comes of it, I don't know. They are mostly intelligent and gentleman-looking young men, and foreigners in the interior are really much indebted to them. If I am at any time in difficulties, I apply to them, and though they are disposed to be somewhat de haut en bas, they are sure to help one, except about roots, of which they always profess ignorance. On the whole, I like Kubota better than any other Japanese town, perhaps because it is so completely Japanese and has no air of having seen better days. I no longer care to meet Europeans. Indeed, I should go far out of my way to avoid them. I have become quite used to Japanese life, and think that I learn more about it in traveling in this solitary way than I should otherwise. Letter 23. Kubota, July 24. I am here still, not altogether because the town is fascinating, but because the rain is so ceaseless as to be truly a plague of immoderate rain and waters. Travelers keep coming in with stories of the impassability of the roads and the carrying away of bridges. Ito amuses me very much by his remarks. He thinks that my visit to the school and hospital must have raised Japan in my estimation, and he is talking rather big. He asked me if I noticed that all the students kept their mouths shut like educated men and residents of Tokyo, and that all country people keep theirs open. I have said little about him for some time, but I daily feel more dependent on him, not only for all information, but actually for getting on. At night he has my watch, passport, and half my money, and I often wonder what would become of me if he absconded before morning. He is not a good boy. He has no moral sense, according to our notions. He dislikes foreigners, his manner is often very disagreeable, and yet I doubt whether I could have obtained a more valuable servant and interpreter. When we left Tokyo, he spoke fairly good English, but by practice and industrious study he now speaks better than any official interpreter that I have seen, and his vocabulary is daily increasing. He never uses a word inaccurately when he has once got hold of his meaning, and his memory never fails. He keeps a diary both in English and Japanese, and it shows much painstaking observation. He reads it to me sometimes, and it is interesting to hear what a young man, who has travelled as much as he has, regards as novel in this northern region. He has made a hotel book and a transport book, in which all the bills and receipts are written, and he daily transliterates the names of all places into English letters, and puts down the distances and the sums paid for transport and hotels on each bill. He inquires the number of houses in each place from the police or transport agent, and the special trade of each town, and notes them down for me. He takes great pains to be accurate, and occasionally remarks about some piece of information that he is not quite certain about. If it's not true, it's not worth having. He is never late, never dawdles, never goes out in the evening except on errands for me, never touches sake, is never disobedient, never requires to be told the same thing twice, is always within hearing, has a good deal of tact as to what he repeats, and all with an undisguised view to his own interest. He sends most of his wages to his mother, who is a widow, it's the custom of the country, and seems to spend the remainder on sweetmeats, tobacco, and the luxury of frequent shampooing. That he would tell a lie if it served his purpose, and would squeeze up to the limits of extortion if he could do it unobserved, I have not the slightest doubt. He seems to have but little heart, or any idea of any but vicious pleasures. He has no religion of any kind, he has been too much with foreigners for that. His frankness is something startling. He has no idea of reticence on any subject, but probably I learn more about things as they really are from this very defect. In virtue, in man or woman, except in that of his former master, he has little, if any, belief. He thinks that Japan is right in availing herself of the discoveries made by foreigners, and that they have as much to learn from her, and that she will outstrip them in the race, because she takes all that is worth having and rejects the incubus of Christianity. Patriotism is, I think, his strongest feeling, and I never met with such a boastful display of it, except in a Scotchman or an American. He despises the uneducated, as he can read and write both the syllabaries. For foreign rank or position he has not an atom of reverence or value, but a great deal of both for Japanese officialdom. He despises the intellects of women, but flirts in a town-bred fashion with the simple tea-house girls. He is anxious to speak the very best English, and to say that a word is slangy or common interdicts its use. Sometimes, when the weather is fine and things go smoothly, he is in an excellent and communicative humor, and talks a good deal as we travel. A few days ago I remarked, "What a beautiful day this is!" And soon after, notebook in hand, he said, "You say, 'a beautiful day.' Is that better English than a devilish fine day, which most foreigners say?" I replied that it was common, and beautiful has been brought out frequently since. Again, when you ask a question, you never say, "What the devil is it?" as other foreigners do. Is it proper for men to say it and not for women? I told him it was proper for neither, it was a very common word, and I saw that he erased it from his notebook. At first he always used fellows for men, as, "Will you have 1 or 2 fellows for your kuruma?" Fellows and women. At last he called the chief physician of the hospital here a fellow, on which I told him that it was slightly slangy, and at least colloquial, and for 2 days he has scrupulously spoken of man and men. Today he brought a boy with very sore eyes to see me, on which I exclaimed, "Poor little fellow!" And this evening he said, "You called that boy a fellow, I thought it was a bad word." The habits of many of the Yokohama foreigners have helped to obliterate any distinctions between right and wrong, if he ever made any. If he wishes to tell me that he has seen a very tipsy man, he always says he has seen "a fellow as drunk as an Englishman." At Nikko I asked him how many legal wives a man could have in Japan, and he replied, "Only 1 lawful one, but as many others, mekake, as he can support, just as Englishmen have." He never forgets a correction. Till I told him it was slangy, he always spoke of inebriated people as tight, and when I gave him the words tipsy, drunk, intoxicated, he asked me which one would use in writing good English, and since then he has always spoken of people as intoxicated. He naturally likes large towns, and tries to deter me from taking the unbeaten tracks, which I prefer, but when he finds me immovable, always concludes his arguments with the same formula: "Well, of course you can do as you like, it's all the same to me." I do not think he cheats me to any extent. Board, lodging, and travelling expenses for us both are about 6s. 6d. a day, and about 2s. 6d. when we are stationary, and this includes all gratuities and extras. True, the board and lodging consist of tea, rice, and eggs, a copper basin of water, an andon, and an empty room, for though there are plenty of chickens in all the villages, the people won't be bribed to sell them for killing, though they would gladly part with them if they were to be kept to lay eggs. Ito amuses me nearly every night with stories of his unsuccessful attempts to provide me with animal food. The travelling is the nearest approach to "a ride on a trail" that I have ever made. I have now ridden, or rather sat, upon 76 horses, all horrible. They all stumble. The loins of some are higher than their shoulders, so that one slips forwards, and the backbones of all are ridgy. Their hind feet grow into points which turn up, and their hind legs all turn outwards like those of a cat, from carrying heavy burdens at an early age. The same thing gives them a roll in their gait, which is increased by their awkward shoes. In summer they feed chiefly on leaves, supplemented with mashes of bruised beans, and instead of straw they sleep on beds of leaves. In their stalls their heads are tied where their tails should be, and their fodder is placed not in a manger, but in a swinging bucket. Those used in this part of Japan are worth from 15 to 30 yen. I have not seen any overloading or ill treatment. They are neither kicked nor beaten nor threatened in rough tones, and when they die they are decently buried and have stones placed over their graves. It might be well if the end of a worn-out horse were somewhat accelerated, but this is mainly a Buddhist region, and the aversion to taking animal life is very strong. Letter 24. Kubota, July 25. The weather at last gives a hope of improvement, and I think I shall leave tomorrow. I had written this sentence when Ito came in to say that the man in the next house would like to see my stretcher and mosquito net, and had sent me a bag of cakes with the usual bit of seaweed attached to show that it was a present. The Japanese believe themselves to be descended from a race of fishermen. They are proud of it, and Yebis, the god of fishermen, is one of the most popular of the household divinities. The piece of seaweed sent with a present to any ordinary person, and the piece of dried fish skin which accompanies a present to the Mikado, record the origin of the race, and at the same time typify the dignity of simple industry. Of course I consented to receive the visitor, and with the mercury at 84 degrees, 5 men, 2 boys, and 5 women entered my small, low room, and after bowing to the earth 3 times, sat down on the floor. They had evidently come to spend the afternoon. Trays of tea and sweetmeats were handed round, and the tobacco bon was brought in, and they all smoked, as I had told Ito that all usual courtesies were to be punctiliously performed. They expressed their gratification at seeing so honourable a traveller. I expressed mine at seeing so much of their honourable country. Then we all bowed profoundly. Then I laid Brunton's map on the floor and showed them my route, showed them the Asiatic Society's transactions, and how we read from left to right instead of from top to bottom, showed them my knitting, which amazed them, and my Berlin work, and then had nothing left. Then they began to entertain me, and I found that the real object of their visit was to exhibit an infant prodigy, a boy of 4 with a head shaven all but a tuft on the top, a face of preternatural thoughtfulness and gravity, and the self-possessed and dignified demeanour of an elderly man. He was dressed in scarlet silk hakama and a dark striped blue silk kimono, and fanned himself gracefully, looking at everything as intelligently and courteously as the others. To talk child's talk to him, or show him toys, or try to amuse him, would have been an insult. The monster has taught himself to read and write, and has composed poetry. His father says that he never plays, and understands everything just like a grown person. The intention was that I should ask him to write, and I did so. It was a solemn performance. A red blanket was laid in the middle of the floor, with a lacquer writing box upon it. The creature rubbed the ink with water on the inkstone, unrolled 4 rolls of paper, 5 feet long, and inscribed them with Chinese characters, 9 inches long, of the most complicated kind, with firm and graceful curves of his brush, and with the ease and certainty of Giotto in turning his O. He sealed them with his seal in vermilion, bowed 3 times, and the performance was ended. People get him to write kakemonos and signboards for them, and he had earned 10 yen, or about £2, that day. His father is going to travel to Kyoto with him to see if anyone under 14 can write as well. I never saw such an exaggerated instance of child worship. Father, mother, friends, and servants treated him as if he were a prince. The housemaster, who is a most polite man, procured me an invitation to the marriage of his niece, and I have just returned from it. He has 3 wives himself. One keeps a yadoya in Kyoto, another in Morioka, and the 3rd and youngest is with him here. From her limitless stores of apparel she chose what she considered a suitable dress for me, an underdress of sage green silk crepe, a kimono of soft green striped silk of a darker shade, with a fold of white crepe spangled with gold at the neck, and a girdle of a sage green corded silk, with the family badge here and then upon it in gold. I went with the housemaster, Ito, to his disgust, not being invited, and his absence was like the loss of one of my senses, as I could not get any explanations till afterwards. The ceremony did not correspond with the rules laid down for marriages in the books of etiquette that I have seen, but this is accounted for by the fact that they were for persons of the samurai class, while this bride and bridegroom, though the children of well-to-do merchants, belonged to the heimin. In this case the trousseau and furniture were conveyed to the bridegroom's house in the early morning, and I was allowed to go to see them. There were several girdles of silk embroidered with gold, several pieces of brocaded silk for kimonos, several pieces of silk crepe, a large number of made-up garments, a piece of white silk, 6 barrels of wine or sake, and 7 sorts of condiments. Jewelry is not worn by women in Japan. The furniture consisted of 2 wooden pillows, finely lacquered, one of them containing a drawer for ornamental hairpins, some cotton futons, 2 very handsome silk ones, a few silk cushions, a lacquer workbox, a spinning wheel, a lacquer rice bucket and ladle, 2 ornamental iron kettles, various kitchen utensils, 3 bronze hibachi, 2 tobacco bonds, some lacquer trays, and zens, china kettles, teapots, and cups, some lacquer rice bowls, 2 copper basins, a few towels, some bamboo switches, and an inlaid lacquer étagère. As the things are all very handsome, the parents must be well off. The sake is sent in accordance with rigid etiquette. The bridegroom is 22, the bride 17, and very comely, so far as I could see through the paint with which she was profusely disfigured. Towards evening she was carried in a norimon, accompanied by her parents and friends, to the bridegroom's house, each member of the procession carrying a Chinese lantern. When the housemaster and I arrived, the wedding party was assembled in a large room, the parents and friends of the bridegroom being seated on one side, and those of the bride on the other. 2 young girls, very beautifully dressed, brought in the bride, a very pleasing-looking creature dressed entirely in white silk, with a veil of white silk covering from head to foot. The bridegroom, who was already seated in the middle of the room near its upper part, did not rise to receive her, and kept his eyes fixed on the ground, and she sat opposite to him, but never looked up. A low table was placed in front, on which there was a 2-spouted kettle full of sake, some sake bottles and some cups, and on another there were some small figures representing a fir tree, a plum tree in blossom, and a stork standing on a tortoise, the last representing length of days, and the former the beauty of women and the strength of men. Shortly a zen loaded with eatables was placed before each person, and the feast began, accompanied by the noises which signify gastronomic gratification. After this, which was only a preliminary, the 2 girls who brought in the bride handed round a tray with 3 cups containing sake, which each person was expected to drain till he came to the god of luck at the bottom. The bride and bridegroom then retired, but shortly reappeared in other dresses of ceremony, but the bride still wore her white silk veil, which one day will be her shroud. An old gold lacquered tray was produced, with 3 sake cups, which were filled by the 2 bridesmaids and placed before the parents-in-law and the bride. The father-in-law drank 3 cups and handed the cup to the bride, who, after drinking 2 cups, received from her father-in-law a present in a box, drank the 3rd cup, and then returned the cup to the father-in-law, who again drank 3 cups. Rice and fish were next brought in, after which the bridegroom's mother took the 2nd cup, and filled and emptied it 3 times, after which she passed it to the bride, who drank 2 cups, received the present from her mother-in-law in a lacquer box, drank a 3rd cup, and gave the cup to the elder lady, who again drank 3 cups. Soup was then served, and then the bride drank once from the 3rd cup, and handed it to her husband's father, who drank 3 more cups. The bride took it again, and drank 2, and lastly the mother-in-law drank 3 more cups. Now, if you possess the clear-sightedness which I labored to preserve, you will perceive that each of the 3 had imbibed 9 cups of some generous liquor. After this, the 2 bridesmaids raised the 2-spouted kettle and presented it to the lips of the married pair, who drank from it alternately till they had exhausted its contents. This concluding ceremony is said to be emblematic of the tasting together of the joys and sorrows of life. And so they became man and wife, till death or divorce parted them. This drinking of sake or wine, according to prescribed usage, appeared to constitute the marriage service, to which none but relations were bidden. Immediately afterwards the wedding guests arrived, and the evening was spent in feasting and sake drinking, but the fare is simple, and intoxication is happily out of place at a marriage feast. Every detail is a matter of etiquette, and has been handed down for centuries. Except for the interest of the ceremony, in that light it was a very dull and tedious affair, conducted in a melancholy silence, and the young bride, with her whitened face and painted lips, looked and moved like an automaton. Letter 25. Tsukurata, July 27. 3 miles of good road, thronged with half the people of Kubota on foot and in kurumas, red vans drawn by horses, pairs of policemen in kurumas, hundreds of children being carried, hundreds more on foot, little girls, formal and precocious looking, with hair dressed with scarlet crepe and flowers, hobbling toilsomely along on high clogs, groups of men and women, never intermixing, stalls driving a roaring trade in cakes and sweetmeats, women making mochi as fast as the buyers ate it, broad rice fields rolling like a green sea on the right, an ocean of liquid turquoise on the left, the grey roofs of Kubota looking out from their green surroundings, Taihei-san in deepest indigo blocking the view to the south, a glorious day and a summer sun streaming over all, made up the cheeriest and most festal scene that I have seen in Japan. Men, women and children, vans and kurumas, policemen and horsemen, all on their way to a mean-looking town, Minato, the junk port of Kubota, which was keeping matsuri, or festival, in honor of the birthday of the god Shimai. Towering above the low grey houses there were objects which at first looked like 5 enormous black fingers, then like trees with their branches wrapped in black, and then comparison ceased, they were a mystery. Dismissing the kurumas, which could go no farther, we dived into the crowd, which was wedged along a mean street, nearly a mile long, a miserable street of poor tea-houses and poor shop-fronts. But, in fact, you could hardly see the street for the people. Paper lanterns were hung close together along its whole length. There were rude scaffoldings supporting matted and covered platforms, on which people were drinking tea and sake and enjoying the crowd below, monkey theatres and dog theatres, 2 mangy sheep and a lean pig attracting wondering crowds, for neither of these animals is known in this region of Japan. A booth in which a woman was having her head cut off every half hour for 2 sen a spectator, cars with roofs like temples, on which, with 40 men at the ropes, dancing children of the highest class were being borne in procession, a theatre with an open front, on the boards of which 2 men in antique dresses, with sleeves touching the ground, were performing with tedious slowness a classic dance of tedious posturings, which consisted mainly in dexterous movement of the aforesaid sleeves, and occasional emphatic stampings, and utterances of the word "no" in a hoarse howl. It is needless to say that a foreign lady was not the least of the attractions of the fair. The cultus of children was still in full force. All sorts of masks, dolls, sugar figures, toys, and sweetmeats were exposed for sale on mats on the ground, and found their way into the hands and sleeves of the children, for no Japanese parent would ever attend a matsuri without making an offering to his child. The police told me that there were 22,000 strangers in Minato, yet for 32,000 holiday makers a force of 25 policemen was sufficient. I did not see one person under the influence of sake up to 3 p.m. when I left, nor a solitary instance of rude or improper behavior, nor was I in any way rudely crowded upon, for even when the crowd was densest, the people of their own accord formed the ring and left me breathing space. We went to the place where the throng was greatest, round the 2 great matsuri cars, whose colossal erections we had seen far off. These were structures of heavy beams, 30 feet long, with 8 huge solid wheels. Upon them there were several scaffoldings with projections, like flat surfaces of cedar branches, and 2 special peaks of unequal height at the top, the whole being nearly 50 feet from the ground. All these projections were covered with black cotton cloth, from which branches of pines protruded. In the middle, 3 small wheels, one above another, over which striped white cotton was rolling perpetually, represented a waterfall. At the bottom, another arrangement of white cotton represented a river, and an arrangement of blue cotton, fitfully agitated by a bear of bellows below, represented the sea. The whole is intended to represent a mountain on which the Shinto gods slew some devils, but anything more rude and barbarous could scarcely be seen. On the fronts of each car, under a canopy, were 30 performers on 30 diabolical instruments, which rent the air with a truly infernal discord, and suggested devils rather than their conquerors. High on the flat projections there were groups of monstrous figures. On one, a giant in brass armor, much like the Neo of temple gates, was killing a revolting-looking demon. On another, a daimyo's daughter, in robes of cloth of gold with satin sleeves richly flowered, was playing on the samisen. On another, a hunter, thrice the size of life, was killing a wild horse equally magnified, whose hide was represented by the hairy wrappings of the leaves of the Kamaerops excelsa. On others, highly colored gods and devils equally hideous were grouped miscellaneously. These 2 cars were being drawn up and down the street at the rate of a mile in 3 hours by 200 men each, numbers of men with levers assisting the heavy wheels out of the mud holes. This matsuri, which, like an English fair, feast, or revel, has lost its original religious significance, goes on for 3 days and nights, and this was its 3rd and greatest day. We left on mild-tempered horses, quite unlike the fierce fellows of Yamagata-ken. Between Minato and Kado there is a very curious lagoon on the left, about 17 miles long by 16 broad, connected with the sea by a narrow channel, guarded by 2 high hills called Shinzan and Honzan. 2 Dutch engineers are now engaged in reporting on its capacities, and if its outlet could be deepened without enormous cost, it would give northwestern Japan the harbor it so greatly needs. Extensive rice fields and many villages lie along the road, which is an avenue of deep sand and ancient pines, much contorted and gnarled. Down the pine avenue, hundreds of people on horseback and on foot were trooping into Minato from all the farming villages, glad in the glorious sunshine which succeeded 4 days of rain. There were hundreds of horses, wonderful-looking animals in bravery of scarlet cloth and lacquer and fringed nets of leather, and many straw wisps and ropes, with Gothic roofs for saddles and dependent panniers on each side, carrying 2 grave and stately-looking children in each, and sometimes a father or a 5th child on the top of the pack-saddle. I was so far from well that I was obliged to sleep at the wretched village of Abukawa in a loft alive with fleas, where the rice was too dirty to be eaten, and where the housemaster's wife, who sat for an hour on my floor, was sorely afflicted with skin disease. The clay houses have disappeared, and the villages are now built of wood, but Abukawa is an antiquated ramshackle place, propped up with posts and slanting beams projecting into the roadway for the entanglement of unwary passengers. The village smith was opposite, but he was not a man of ponderous strength, nor were there those wondrous flights and scintillations of sparks which were the joy of our childhood in the Tattenhall forge. A fire of powdered charcoal on the floor, always being trimmed and replenished by a lean and grimy satellite, a man still leaner and grimier, clothed in goggles and a girdle, always sitting in front of it, heating and hammering iron bars with his hands, with a clink which went on late into the night, and blowing his bellows with his toes, bars and pieces of rusty iron pinned on the smoky walls, and a group of idle men watching his skilful manipulation, were the sights of the Abukawa smithy, and kept me thralled in the balcony, though the whole clothless population stood for the whole evening in front of the house, with a silent, open-mouthed stare. Early in the morning the same melancholy crowd appeared in the dismal drizzle, which turned into a tremendous torrent which has lasted for 16 hours. Low hills, broad rice valleys in which people are puddling the rice a second time to kill the weeds, bad roads, pretty villages, much indigo, few passengers, were the features of the day's journey. At Morioka and several other villages in this region, I noticed that if you see one large, high, well-built house standing in enclosed grounds with a look of wealth about it, it is always that of the sake brewer. A bush denotes the manufacture as well as the sale of sake, and these are of all sorts, from the mangy bit of fir which has seen long service to the vigorous truss of pine constantly renewed. It is curious that this should formerly have been the sign of the sale of wine in England. The wind and rain were something fearful all that afternoon. I could not ride, so I tramped on foot for some miles under an avenue of pines through water a foot deep, and, with my paper waterproof soaked through, reached Toyoka half drowned and very cold, to shiver over a hibachi in a clean loft, hung with my dripping clothes, which had to be put on wet the next day. By 5 a.m. all Toyoka assembled, and while I took my breakfast, I was not only the cynosure of the eyes of all the people outside, but of those of about 40 more who were standing in the doma, looking up the ladder. When asked to depart by the housemaster, they said, "It's neither fair nor neighbourly in you to keep this great sight to yourself, seeing that our lives may pass without again looking on a foreign woman." So they were allowed to remain. Letter 26. Odate, July 29th. I have been suffering so much from my spine that I have been unable to travel more than 7 or 8 miles daily for several days, and even that with great difficulty. I try my own saddle, then a pack saddle, then walk through the mud, but I only get on because getting on is a necessity, and as soon as I reach the night's halting place I am obliged to lie down at once. Only strong people should travel in northern Japan. The inevitable fatigue is much increased by the state of the weather, and doubtless my impressions of the country are affected by it also, as a hamlet in a quagmire in a grey mist or a soaking rain is a far less delectable object than the same hamlet under bright sunshine. There has not been such a season for 30 years. The rains have been tremendous. I have lived in soaked clothes, in spite of my rain-cloak, and have slept on a soaked stretcher in spite of all waterproof wrappings, for several days, And still the weather shows no signs of improvement, and the rivers are so high on the northern road that I am storm-bound as well as pain-bound here. Ito shows his sympathy for me by intense surliness, though he did say very sensibly, "I am very sorry for you, but it's no use saying so over and over again. As I can do nothing for you, you'd better send for the blind man." In Japanese towns and villages you hear every evening a man, or men, making a low peculiar whistle as he walks along, and in large towns the noise is quite a nuisance. It is made by blind men, but a blind beggar is never seen throughout Japan, and the blind are an independent, respected, and well-to-do class, carrying on the occupations of shampooing, money-lending, and music. We have had a very severe journey from Toyoka. That night the rain was ceaseless, and in the driving mists one could see little but low hills looming on the horizon, pine barrens, scrub and flooded rice fields, varied by villages standing along roads which were quagmires a foot deep, and where the clothing was especially ragged and dirty. Hinokiyama, a village of samurai on a beautiful slope, was an exception, with its fine detached houses, pretty gardens, deep-roofed gateways, grass and stone-faced terraces, and look of refined, quiet comfort. Everywhere there was a quantity of indigo, as is necessary, for nearly all the clothing of the lower classes is blue. Near a large village we were riding on a causeway through the rice fields, Ito on the pack-horse in front, when we met a number of children returning from school, who, on getting near us, turned, ran away, and even jumped into the ditches, screaming as they ran. The mago ran after them, caught the hindmost boy, and dragged him back, the boy scared and struggling, the man laughing. The boy said that they thought that Ito was a monkey player, that is, the keeper of a monkey theatre, I a big ape, and the poles of my bed the scaffolding of the stage. Splashing through mire and water, we found that the people of Tubine wished to detain us, saying that all the ferries were stopped in consequence of the rise of the river. But I had been so often misled by false reports that I took fresh horses and went on by a track along a very pretty hillside, overlooking the Yonetsurugawa, a large and swollen river, which nearer the sea had spread itself over the whole country. Torrents of rain were still falling, and all out-of-doors industries were suspended. Straw rain cloaks hanging to dry dripped under all the eaves, our paper cloaks were sodden, our dripping horses steamed, and thus we slid down a steep descent into the hamlet of Kiriishi, 31 houses clustered under persimmon trees under a wooded hillside, all standing in a quagmire, and so abject and filthy that one could not ask for 5 minutes' shelter in any one of them. Sure enough, on the bank of the river, which was fully 400 yards wide, and swirling like a mill-stream with a suppressed roar, there was an official order prohibiting the crossing of man or beast, and before I had time to think, the mago had deposited the baggage on an islet in the mire and was over the crest of the hill. I wished that the government was a little less paternal. Just in the nick of time we discerned a punt drifting down the river on the opposite side, where it brought up, and landed a man, and Ito and 2 others yelled, howled, and waved so lustily as to attract its notice, and to my joy an answering yell came across the roar and rush of the river. The torrent was so strong that the boatmen had to pole up on that side for half a mile, and in about 3/4 of an hour they reached our side. They were returning to Kotsunagi, the very place I wished to reach, but, though only 2½ miles off, the distance took nearly 4 hours of the hardest work I ever saw done by men. Every moment I expected to see them rupture blood vessels or tendons. All their muscles quivered. It is a mighty river, and was from 8 to 12 feet deep, and whirling down in muddy eddies, and often with their utmost efforts in poling, when it seemed as if poles or backs must break, the boat hung trembling and stationary for 3 or 4 minutes at a time. After the slow and eventless tramp of the last few days, this was an exciting transit. Higher up there was a flooded wood, and, getting into this, the men aided themselves considerably by hauling by the trees, but when we got out of this, another river joined the Yonetsurugawa, which with added strength rushed and roared more wildly. I had long been watching a large houseboat far above us on the other side, which was being poled by desperate efforts by 10 men. At that point she must have been half a mile off, when the stream overpowered the crew, and in no time she swung round and came drifting wildly down and across the river, broadside on to us. We could not stir against the current, and had large trees on our immediate left, and for a moment it was a question whether she would not smash us to atoms. Ito was livid with fear, his white appalled face struck me as ludicrous, for I had no other thought than the imminent peril of the large boat with her freight of helpless families, when, just as she was within 2 feet of us, she struck a stem and glanced off. Then her crew grappled a headless trunk and got their hawser round it, and 8 of them, one behind the other, hung onto it, when it suddenly snapped. 7 fell backwards, and the forward one went overboard to be no more seen. Some house that night was desolate. Reeling downwards, the big mast and spar of the ungainly craft caught in a tree, giving her such a check that they were able to make her fast. It was a saddening incident. I asked Ito what he felt when we seemed in peril, and he replied, "I thought I'd been good to my mother, and honest, I hoped I should go to a good place." The fashion of boats varies much on different rivers. On this one there are 2 sizes. Ours was a small one, flat-bottomed, 25 feet long by 2½ broad, drawing 6 inches, very low in the water, and with sides slightly curved inwards. The prow forms a gradual long curve from the body of the boat and is very high. The mists rolled away as dusk came on and revealed a lovely country with much picturesqueness of form, and near Kotsunagi the river disappears into a narrow gorge with steep sentinel hills, dark with pine and cryptomeria. To cross the river we had to go fully a mile above the point aimed at, and then a few minutes of express speed brought us to a landing in a deep, tough quagmire in a dark wood, through which we groped our lamentable way to the yadoya. A heavy mist came on, and the rain returned in torrents. The doma was ankle-deep in black slush. The daidokoro was open to the roof. Roof and rafters were black with smoke, and the great fire of damp wood was smoking lustily. Round some live embers in the irori, 15 men, women, and children were lying, doing nothing, by the dim light of an andon. It was picturesque decidedly, and I was well disposed to be content, when the production of some handsome fusuma created daimyo's rooms out of the farthest part of the dim and wandering space, opening up a damp garden into which the rain splashed all night. The solitary spoil of the day's journey was a glorious lily which I presented to the housemaster, and in the morning it was blooming on the kamidama in a small vase of priceless old Satsuma china. I was awoke out of sound sleep by Ito coming in with a rumor, brought by some travelers, that the Prime Minister had been assassinated and 50 policemen killed. This was probably a distorted version of the partial mutiny of the Imperial Guard, which I learned on landing in Yezo. Very wild political rumors are in the air in these outlandish regions, and it is not very wonderful that the peasantry lack confidence in the existing order of things after the changes of the last 10 years and the recent assassination of the Home Minister. I did not believe the rumor, for fanaticism, even in its wildest moods, usually owes some allegiance to common sense. But it was disturbing, as I have naturally come to feel a deep interest in Japanese affairs. A few hours later, Ito again presented himself with a bleeding cut on his temple. In lighting his pipe, an odious nocturnal practice of the Japanese, he had fallen over the edge of the fire-pot. I always sleep in a Japanese kimono to be ready for emergencies, and soon bound up his head, and slept again, to be awoke early by another deluge. We made an early start, but got over very little ground, owing to bad roads and long delays. All day the rain came down in even torrents, the tracks were nearly impassable, my horse fell 5 times. I suffered severely from pain and exhaustion, and almost fell into despair about ever reaching the sea. In these wild regions there are no kago or norimons to be had, and a pack horse is the only conveyance, and yesterday, having abandoned my own saddle, I had the bad luck to get a pack saddle with specially angular and uncompromising peaks, with a soaked and extremely unwashed futon on the top, spars, tackle, ridges, and furrows of the most exasperating description, and 2 nooses of rope to hold on by as the animal slid downhill on his haunches, or let me almost slide over his tail as he scrambled and plunged uphill. It was pretty country, even in the downpour, when white mists parted and fir-crowned heights looked out for a moment, or we slid down into a deep glen with mossy boulders, lichen-covered stumps, ferny carpet, and damp, balsamy smell of pyramidal cryptomeria, and a tawny torrent dashing through it in gusts of passion. Then there were low hills, much scrub, immense rice fields, and violent inundations. But it is not pleasant, even in the prettiest country, to cling to a pack saddle with a saturated quilt below you and the water slowly soaking down through your wet clothes into your boots, knowing all the time that when you halt you must sleep on a wet bed and change into damp clothes and put on the wet ones again the next morning. The villages were poor, and most of the houses were of boards rudely nailed together for ends, and for sides straw rudely tied on. They had no windows, and smoke came out of every crack. They were as unlike the houses which travellers see in southern Japan as a black hut in Uist is like a cottage in a trim village in Kent. These peasant proprietors have much to learn of the art of living. At Tsuguriko, the next stage, where the transport office was so dirty that I was obliged to sit in the street in the rain, they told us that we could only get on a ri farther, because the bridges were all carried away and the fords were impassable. But I engaged horses, and by dint of British doggedness and the willingness of the mago, I got the horses singly and without their loads in small punts across the swollen waters of the Hayakuchi, the Yuase, and the Mochida, and finally forded 3 branches of my old friend the Yonetsurugawa, with the foam of its hurrying waters whitening the men's shoulders and the horses' packs, and with 100 Japanese looking on at the folly of the foreigner. I like to tell you of kind people everywhere, and the 2 mago were specially so, for when they found that I was pushing on to Yezo for fear of being laid up in the interior wilds, they did all they could to help me, lifted me gently from the horse, made steps of their backs for me to mount, and gathered for me handfuls of red berries, which I ate out of politeness, though they tasted of some nauseous drug. They suggested that I should stay at the picturesquely situated old village of Kawaguchi, but everything about it was mildewed and green with damp, and the stench from the green and black ditches with which it abounded was so overpowering, even in passing through, that I was obliged to ride on to Odate, a crowded, forlorn, half-tumbling to pieces town of 8,000 people, with bark roofs held down by stones. The yadoyas are crowded with storm-stayed travellers, and I had a weary tramp from one to another, almost sinking from pain, pressed upon by an immense crowd, and frequently bothered by a policeman, who followed me from one place to the other, making wholly unrighteous demands for my passport at that most inopportune time. After a long search I could get nothing better than this room, with fusuma of tissue paper, in the center of the din of the house, close to the doma and daidokoro. 50 travelers, nearly all men, are here, mostly speaking at the top of their voices and in a provincial jargon which exasperates Ito. Cooking, bathing, eating, and, worst of all, perpetual drawing water from a well with a creaking, hoisting apparatus, are going on from 4:30 in the morning till 11:30 at night, and on both evenings noisy mirth of alcoholic inspiration and dissonant performances by geisha have added to the dim. In all places lately, hai, yes, has been pronounced he, chi, na, ne, to Ito's great contempt. It sounds like an expletive or interjection rather than a response, and seems used often as a sign of respect or attention only. Often it is loud and shrill, then guttural, at times little more than a sigh. In these yadoyas every sound is audible, and I hear low rumbling of mingled voices, and above all the sharp hi, hi of the tea-house girls in full chorus from every quarter of the house. The habit of saying it is so strong that a man roused out of sleep jumps up with hi, hi, and often when I speak to Ito in English, a stupid Hebe sitting by answers hi. I don't want to convey a false impression of the noise here. It would be at least 3 times as great were I in equally close proximity to a large hotel kitchen in England, with 50 Brightons only separated from me by paper partitions. I had not been long in bed on Saturday night when I was awoke by Ito bringing in an old hen which he said he could stew till it was tender, and I fell asleep again with its dying squeak in my ears, to be awoke a second time by 2 policemen wanting for some occult reason to see my passport, and a third time by 2 men with lanterns scrambling and fumbling about the room for the strings of a mosquito net which they wanted for another traveller. These are among the ludicrous incidents of Japanese travelling. About 5, Ito woke me by saying he was quite sure that the moxa would be the thing to cure my spine, and as we were going to stay all day, he would go and fetch an operator. But I rejected this as emphatically as the services of the blind man. Yesterday a man came and pasted slips of paper over all the peepholes in the shoji, and I have been very little annoyed, even though the yadoya is so crowded. The rain continues to come down in torrents, and rumours are hourly arriving of disasters to roads and bridges in the northern route. Early this morning the rain clouds rolled themselves up and disappeared, and the bright blue sky looked as if it had been well washed. I had to wait till noon before the rivers became fordable, and my day's journey is only 7 miles, as it is not possible to go farther till more of the waters run off. We had very limp, melancholy horses, and my mago was half tipsy, and sang, talked, and jumped the whole way. Sake is frequently taken warm, and in that state produces a very noisy but good-tempered intoxication. I have seen a good many intoxicated persons, but never one in the least degree quarrelsome, and the effect very soon passes off, leaving, however, an unpleasant nausea for 2 or 3 days as a warning against excess. The abominable concoctions known under the names of beer, wine, and brandy produce a bad-tempered and prolonged intoxication, and delirium tremens, rarely known as a result of sake drinking, is being introduced under their baleful influence. The sun shone gloriously and brightened the hill-girdled valley in which Odate stands into positive beauty, with the narrow river flinging its bright waters over green and red shingle, lighting it up in glints among the conical hills, some richly wooded with coniferae, and others merely covered with scrub, which were tumbled about in picturesque confusion. When Japan gets the sunshine, its forest-covered hills and garden-like valleys are turned into paradise. In a journey of 600 miles there has hardly been a patch of country which would not have been beautiful in sunlight. We crossed 5 severe fords with the water halfway up the horses' bodies, in one of which the strong current carried my mago off his feet, and the horse towed him ashore, singing and capering, his drunken glee nothing abated by his cold bath. Everything is in a state of wreck. Several river channels have been formed in places where there was only one. There is not a trace of the road for a considerable distance. Not a bridge exists for 10 miles, and a great tract of country is covered with boulders, uprooted trees, and logs floated from the mountain sides. Already, however, these industrious peasants are driving piles, carrying soil for embankments in creels on horses' backs, and making ropes of stones to prevent a recurrence of the calamity. About here the female peasants wear for field work a dress which pleases me much by its suitability: light blue trousers with a loose sack over them, confined at the waist by a girdle. On arriving here in much pain, and knowing that the road was not open any farther, I was annoyed by a long and angry conversation between the housemaster and Ito, during which the horses were not unloaded, and the upshot of it was that the man declined to give me shelter, saying that the police had been round the week before, giving notice that no foreigner was to be received without first communicating with the nearest police station, which, in this instance, is 3 hours off. I said that the authorities of Akita-ken could not by any local regulations override the imperial edict under which passports are issued, but he said he should be liable to a fine and the withdrawal of his license if he violated the rule. No foreigner, he said, had ever lodged in Shirasawa, and I have no doubt that he added that he hoped no foreigner would ever seek lodgings again. My passport was copied and sent off by special runner, as I should have deeply regretted bringing trouble on the poor man by insisting on my rights, and in much trepidation he gave me a room open on one side to the village and on another to a pond, over which, as if to court mosquitoes, it is partially built. I cannot think how the Japanese can regard a hole full of dirty water as an ornamental appendage to a house. My hotel expenses, including Ito's, are less than 3 shillings a day, and in nearly every place there has been a cordial desire that I should be comfortable, and, considering that I have often put up in small, rough hamlets off the great routes even of Japanese travel, the accommodation, minus the fleas and the odours, has been surprisingly excellent, not to be equalled, I should think, in equally remote regions in any country in the world. This evening, here, as in thousands of other villages, the men came home from their work, ate their food, took their smoke, enjoyed their children, carried them about, watched their games, twisted straw ropes, made straw sandals, split bamboo, wove straw raincoats, and spent the time universally in those little economical ingenuities and skilful adaptations which our people, the worse for them, practice perhaps less than any other. There was no assembling at the sake shop. Poor though the homes are, the men enjoy them, the children are an attraction at any rate, and the brawling and disobedience which often turn our working-class homes into bear gardens are unknown here, where docility and obedience are inculcated from the cradle as a matter of course. The signs of religion become fewer as I travel north, and it appears that the little faith which exists consists mainly in a belief in certain charms and superstitions, which the priests industriously foster. A low voice is not regarded as a most excellent thing, in a man at least, among the lower classes in Japan. The people speak at the top of their voices, and, though most words and syllables end in vowels, the general effect of a conversation is like the discordant gabble of a farmyard. The next room to mine is full of storm-bound travellers, and they and the housemaster kept up what I thought was a most important argument for 4 hours at the top of their voices. I supposed it must be on the new and important ordinance granting local elective assemblies, of which I heard at Odate, but on inquiry found that it was possible to spend 4 mortal hours in discussing whether the day's journey from Odate to Noshiro could be made best by road or river. Japanese women have their own gatherings, where gossip and chit-chat, marked by a truly oriental indecorum of speech, are the staple of talk. I think that in many things, especially in some which lie on the surface, the Japanese are greatly our superiors, but that in many others they are immeasurably behind us. In living altogether among this courteous, industrious, and civilized people, one comes to forget that one is doing them a gross injustice in comparing their manners and ways with those of a people molded by many centuries of Christianity. Would to God that we were so Christianized that the comparison might always be favorable to us, which it is not. July 30. In the room on the other side of mine were 2 men with severe eye disease, with shaven heads and long and curious rosaries, who beat small drums as they walked, and were on pilgrimage to the shrine of Fudo at Megura, near Yedo, a seated, flame-surrounded idol with a naked sword in one hand and a coil of rope in the other, who has the reputation of giving sight to the blind. At 5 this morning they began their devotions, which consisted in repeating with great rapidity and in a high monotonous key, for 2 hours, the invocation of the Nichiren sect of Buddhists, Namu Myo Horenge Kyo, which certainly no Japanese understands, and on the meaning of which even the best scholars are divided, one having given me "Glory to the salvation-bringing scriptures," another "Hail, precious law and gospel of the lotus flower," and a third "Heaven and earth, the teachings of the wonderful lotus flower sect." Namu Amidu Butsu occurred at intervals, and 2 drums were beaten the whole time. The rain, which began again at 11 last night, fell from 5 till 8 this morning, not in drops, but in streams, and in the middle of it a heavy pall of blackness, said to be a total eclipse, enfolded all things in a lurid gloom. Any detention is exasperating within 1 day of my journey's end, and I hear without equanimity that there are great difficulties ahead, and that our getting through in 3 or even 4 days is doubtful. I hope you will not be tired of the monotony of my letters. Such as they are, they represent the scenes which a traveller would see throughout much of northern Japan, and whatever interest they have consists in the fact that they are a faithful representation, made upon the spot, of what a foreigner sees and hears in travelling through a large but unfrequented region. Letter 28, Part 1. Ikarigaseki, Aomori-ken, August 2nd. The prophecies concerning difficulties are fulfilled. For 6 days and 5 nights the rain has never ceased, except for a few hours at a time, and for the last 13 hours, as during the eclipse at Shirasawa, it has been falling in such sheets as I have only seen for a few minutes at a time on the equator. I have been here storm-stayed for 2 days, with damp bed, damp clothes, damp everything, and boots, bag, books are all green with mildew. And still the rain falls, and roads, bridges, rice fields, trees, and hillsides are being swept in a common ruin towards the Tsugaru Strait, so tantalizingly near, and the simple people are calling on the forgotten gods of the rivers and the hills, on the sun and moon and all the host of heaven, to save them from this plague of immoderate rain and waters. For myself, to be able to lie down all day is something, and as the mind, when in a healthy state, reposes as quietly before an insurmountable difficulty as before an ascertained truth, so, as I cannot get on, I have ceased to chafe, and am rather inclined to magnify the advantages of the detention, a necessary process, as you would think if you saw my surroundings. The day before yesterday, in spite of severe pain, was one of the most interesting of my journey. As I learned something of the force of fire in Hawaii, I am learning not a little of the force of water in Japan. We left Shirasawa at noon, as it looked likely to clear, taking 2 horses and 3 men. It is beautiful scenery, a wild valley upon which a number of lateral ridges descend, rendered strikingly picturesque by the dark pyramidal cryptomeria, which are truly the glory of Japan. 5 of the fords were deep and rapid, and the entrance on them difficult, as the sloping descents were all carried away, leaving steep banks which had to be levelled by the mattocks of the mago. Then the fords themselves were gone. There were shallows where there had been depths, and depths where there had been shallows. New channels were carved, and great beds of shingle had been thrown up. Much wreckage lay about. The road and its small bridges were all gone, trees torn up by the roots or snapped short off by being struck by heavy logs were heaped together like barricades, leaves and even bark being in many cases stripped completely off. Great logs floated down the river in such numbers and with such a force that we had to wait half an hour in one place to secure a safe crossing. Hollows were filled with liquid mud. Boulders of great size were piled into embankments, causing perilous alterations in the course of the river. A fertile valley had been utterly destroyed, and the men said they could hardly find their way. At the end of 5 miles it became impassable for horses, and with 2 of the mago carrying the baggage, we set off, wading through water and climbing along the side of a hill, up to our knees in soft, wet soil. The hillside and the road were both gone, and there were heavy landslips along the whole valley. Happily there was not much of this exhausting work, for just as higher and darker ranges, densely wooded with cryptomeria, began to close us in, we emerged upon a fine new road, broad enough for a carriage, which, after crossing 2 ravines on fine bridges, plunges into the depths of a magnificent forest, and then by a long series of fine zigzags of easy gradients ascends the pass of Yadate, on the top of which, in a deep sandstone cutting, is a handsome obelisk marking the boundary between Akita and Aomori ken. This is a marvelous road for Japan. It is so well graded and built up, and logs for travelers' rests are placed at convenient distances. Some very heavy work in grading and blasting has been done upon it, but there are only 4 miles of it, with wretched bridle tracks at each end. I left the others behind and strolled on alone over the top of the pass and down the other side, where the road is blasted out of rock of a vivid pink and green color, looking brilliant under the trickle of water. I admire this pass more than anything I have seen in Japan. I even long to see it again, but under a bright blue sky. It reminds me much of the finest part of the Brunig Pass, and something of some of the passes in the Rocky Mountains, but the trees are far finer than in either. It was lonely, stately, dark, solemn. Its huge cryptomeria, straight as masts, sent their tall spires far aloft in search of light. The ferns, which love damp and shady places, were the only undergrowth. The trees flung their balsamy, aromatic scent liberally upon the air, and, in the unlighted depths of many a ravine and hollow, clear bright torrents leaped and tumbled, drowning with their thundering bass the musical treble of the lighter streams. Not a traveller disturbed the solitude with his sandaled footfall. There was neither song of bird nor hum of insect. In the midst of this sublime scenery, and at the very top of the pass, the rain, which had been light but steady during the whole day, began to come down in streams, and then in sheets. I have been so rained upon for weeks that at first I took little notice of it, but very soon changes occurred before my eyes which concentrated my attention upon it. The rush of waters was heard everywhere. Trees of great size slid down, breaking others in their fall. Rocks were rent and carried away trees in their descent. The waters rose before our eyes. With a boom and roar as of an earthquake, a hillside burst, and half the hill, with a noble forest of cryptomeria, was projected outwards, and the trees, with the land on which they grew, went down heads foremost, diverting a river from its course, and where the forest-covered hillside had been, there was a great scar, out of which a torrent burst at high pressure, which in half an hour carved for itself a deep ravine, and carried into the valley below an avalanche of stones and sand. Another hillside descended less abruptly, and its noble groves found themselves at the bottom in a perpendicular position, and will doubtless survive their transplantation. Actually, before my eyes, this fine new road was torn away by hastily improvised torrents, or blocked by landslips in several places, and a little lower, in one moment 100 yards of it disappeared, and with them a fine bridge which was deposited aslant across the torrent lower down. On the descent, when things began to look very bad, and the mountain sides had become cascades, bringing trees, logs, and rocks down with them, we were fortunate enough to meet with 2 pack-horses whose leaders were ignorant of the impassability of the road to Odate, and they and my coolies exchanged loads. These were strong horses, and the mago was skilful and courageous. They said if we hurried we could just get to the hamlet they had left, they thought, but while they spoke the road and the bridge below were carried away. They insisted on lashing me to the pack-saddle. The great stream, whose beauty I had formerly admired, was now a thing of dread, and had to be forded 4 times without fords. It crashed and thundered, drowning the feeble sound of human voices. The torrents from the heavens hissed through the forest. Trees and logs came crashing down the hillsides. 1,000 cascades added to the din, and in the bewilderment produced by such an unusual concatenation of sights and sounds, we stumbled through the river, the men up to their shoulders, the horses up to their backs. Again and again we crossed. The banks being carried away, it was very hard to get either into or out of the water. The horses had to scramble or jump up places as high as their shoulders, all slippery and crumbling, and twice the men cut steps for them with axes. The rush of the torrent at the last crossing taxed the strength of both men and horses, and as I was helpless from being tied on, I confess that I shut my eyes. After getting through, we came upon the lands belonging to this village, rice fields with the dikes burst, and all the beautiful ridge and furrow cultivation of the other crops carried away. The waters were rising fast, the men said we must hurry, they unbound me so that I might ride more comfortably, spoke to the horses, and went on at a run. My horse, which had nearly worn out his shoes in the fords, stumbled at every step. The mago gave me a noose of rope to clutch. The rain fell in such torrents that I speculated on the chance of being washed off my saddle, when suddenly I saw a shower of sparks. I felt unutterable things. I was choked, bruised, stifled, and presently found myself being hauled out of a ditch by 3 men, and realized that the horse had tumbled down in going down a steepish hill, and that I had gone over his head. To climb again on the soaked futon was the work of a moment, and, with men running and horses stumbling and splashing, we crossed the Hirakawa by one fine bridge, and half a mile farther recrossed it on another, wishing as we did so that all Japanese bridges were as substantial, for they were both 100 feet long and had central piers. We entered Ikarigaseki from the last bridge, a village of 800 people, on a narrow ledge between an abrupt hill and the Hirakawa, a most forlorn and tumble-down place, given up to felling timber and making shingles, and timber in all its forms, logs, planks, faggots, and shingles, is heaped and stalked about. It looks more like a lumberer's encampment than a permanent village, but it is beautifully situated, and unlike any of the innumerable villages that I have ever seen. The street is long and narrow, with streams in stone channels on either side, but these had overflowed, and men, women, and children were constructing square dams to keep the water, which had already reached the doma, from rising over the tatami. Hardly any house has paper windows, and in the few which have, they are so black with smoke as to look worse than none. The roofs are nearly flat and are covered with shingles held on by laths and weighted with large stones. Nearly all the houses look like temporary sheds, and most are as black inside as a bara hut. The walls of many are nothing but rough boards tied to the uprights by straw ropes. In the drowning torrent, sitting in puddles of water and drenched to the skin hours before, we reached this very primitive yadoya, the lower part of which is occupied by the daidokoro, a party of storm-bound students, horses, fowls, and dogs. My room is a wretched loft reached by a ladder, with such a quagmire at its foot that I have to descend into it in Wellington boots. It was dismally grotesque at first. The torrent on the unsealed roof prevented Ito from hearing what I said. The bed was soaked, and the water, having got into my box, had dissolved the remains of the condensed milk, and had reduced clothes, books, and paper into a condition of universal stickiness. My kimono was less wet than anything else, and, borrowing a sheet of oiled paper, I lay down in it, till roused up in half an hour by Ito shrieking above the din of the roof that the people thought that the bridge by we had just entered would give way, and, running to the river bank, we joined a large crowd, far too intensely occupied by the coming disaster to take any notice of the first foreign lady they had ever seen. The Hirakawa, which an hour before was merely a clear, rapid mountain stream about 4 feet deep, was then 10 feet deep, they said, and tearing along, thick and muddy, and with a fearful roar. And each wave was crested with tawny foam, like the mane of a chestnut steed. Immense logs of hewn timber, trees, roots, branches, and faggots were coming down in numbers. The abutment on this side was much undermined, but, except that the central pier trembled whenever a log struck it, the bridge itself stood firm, so firm indeed that 2 men, anxious to save some property on the other side, crossed it after I arrived. Then logs of planed timber of large size and joints, and much wreckage, came down, fully 40 fine timbers, 30 feet long, for the fine bridge above had given way. Most of the harvest of logs cut on the Yadate Pass must have been lost, for over 300 were carried down in the short time in which I watched the river. This is a very heavy loss to this village, which lives by the timber trade. Efforts were made at a bank higher up to catch them as they drifted by, but they only saved about 1 in 20. It was most exciting to see the grand way in which these timbers came down, and the moment in which they were to strike or not to strike the pier was one of intense suspense. After an hour of this, 2 superb logs, fully 30 feet long, came down close together, and, striking the central pier nearly simultaneously, it shuddered horribly, the great bridge parted in the middle, gave an awful groan like a living thing, plunged into the torrent, and reappeared in the foam below only as disjointed timbers hurrying to the sea. Not a vestige remained. The bridge below was carried away in the morning, so, till the river becomes fordable, this little place is completely isolated. On 30 miles of road out of 19 bridges, only 2 remain, and the road itself is almost wholly carried away.